Okay, so this is basically what you need to know. It's really just 4 things. Okay? It is 4 things. The neurotransmitters will be super easy. We already know the effects of each division, right? If you memorize, sympathetic is fight or flight. This is what you should memorize. Because you can already figure out the effects if you know it's fight or flight. Parasympathetic is
Rest and digest.
rest and digest. Yay! So see how much you already know. Okay? So we're going to talk about where those preganglionic neurons are located. And there's something else I think you should memorize for this that will help you. Okay? We're going to talk about the parasympathetic division first. For parasympathetic, this division is also called the craniosacral division. Okay, so craniosacral division. So why should you memorize that? Because that name actually tells you where the preganglionic neurons are located. They're in the brainstem, where the axons actually travel with 4 cranial nerves. Okay, cranio. And they're also in the lower part of the spinal cord, the sacral region of the cord. Okay? So we'll talk about exactly what that means. Okay, for the sympathetic division, we will see that this is also called thoracolumbar, the thoracolumbar division. Why? Because the preganglionic neurons are located in the spinal cord in the thoracic and lumbar areas of the cord. Okay? So this may not make a lot of sense to you right now, but when we talk about it, I think you'll understand. So this is just one more thing that if you remember these 2 terms, it will help you to remember this. Okay? Okay. So again, we're going to talk about the parasympathetic division first. And this is just showing where the preganglionic neurons are located for the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. And we're going to start with the parasympathetic. So again, notice that for the parasympathetic, this is also referred to as the craniosacral division because some of the preganglionic neurons are here in the brainstem, and the axons are traveling with 4 of the cranial nerves. So when we talked about the cranial nerves, I did not talk about the parasympathetic neurons. Okay, so we will talk about that now. And then also, notice this is the lower part of the spinal cord. This is called the sacral region of the cord, and some of these preganglionic neurons are located here in the lateral horn of the gray matter, and this is S2 through S4. Okay, so we will talk about these 4 cranial nerves that carry parasympathetic neurons. They're actually listed here. And then you should know that the preganglionic neurons also are located from S2 through S4. Okay, you guys have that so far? So the preganglionic neurons travel with 4 cranial nerves. They are also located from S2 through S4. So let's look at a diagram that just shows the parasympathetic division. And so it will show it in a little bit more detail. And this is what we just talked about, just 2 neurons in the pathway. Don't worry about that. Okay. So this is a diagram that just shows the parasympathetic neurons. Here again, we have the brainstem and these 4 cranial nerves that the axons are going to go out on, and S2 through S4 of the cord, okay, where we also have some parasympathetic neurons going out to mostly organs that are down in the pelvic area. Okay, so if you notice here, this is actually showing a bunch of different organs, right? That's what's controlled by the autonomic nervous system. Smooth muscle in those organs, cardiac muscle of the heart, and glands like salivary glands, all the glands in the digestive system that secrete different, digestive enzymes, things like that. So that's the stuff controlled by autonomic neurons. So let's talk about the parasympathetic neurons that travel with these 4 cranial nerves. Okay, so we said that, for instance, cranial nerve 3, this is cranial nerve 3, right here. You guys remember the number or the name of cranial nerve 3? Oculomotor. So we said that this cranial nerve controls most of our extrinsic eye muscles. Extrinsic eye muscles are the muscles that insert on the outside of the eyeball, and they move the eye when we're looking around. So those are actually skeletal muscles that we control voluntarily. But also, along with those neurons, this nerve carries some parasympathetic neurons that will go inside the eye to the smooth muscle of the eye that controls the size of the pupil and the shape of our lens. Okay, that's called the intrinsic muscle. Okay, so that would be what the parasympathetic neurons that travel with cranial nerve 3 do. So let's just go through these 4 cranial nerves, talk about their parasympathetic neurons. This is something that you will need to know no matter what you're going into, nursing, physical therapy, PA programs, you have to know the cranial nerves, okay? So, that is coming up. Here we go. So these are the 4 cranial nerves that have parasympathetic neurons, cranial nerve 3, 7, 9, and 10. Okay, so again, traveling with cranial nerve 3, these parasympathetic neurons go into the intrinsic muscle, meaning inside the eyeball. This is smooth muscle, so it makes sense. It's controlled by the autonomic nervous system. And this would, again, control the size of the pupil and the shape of our lens. The shape of the lens is what allows us to focus on far versus near objects, okay? So that is what those neurons do. Okay, with cranial nerve 7, the facial nerve, the parasympathetic neurons are going to actually control, I made up a new word, going to control a few glands. So 2 of what we call our major salivary glands, major just means they're large, okay, and the lacrimal gland. The lacrimal gland secretes tears, right. So if you can't remember, just remember that autonomic neurons always control smooth muscle or cardiac muscle or glands, right? So it has to be, if you think of the face area, right, the facial nerve goes to the face area. We got a bunch of glands there. Okay, we actually have 3 major salivary glands, and the facial nerve controls 2 of them. Okay, so this next nerve, cranial nerve 9, carries parasympathetic neurons that will go to that one last major salivary gland. This is the one actually that's right here. Sometimes you feel the secretion of this gland when you're eating certain foods. Okay, and then finally the vagus nerve. So this is the nerve we said that carries sensory information from the organs. It goes all the way down into the thoracic and abdominal cavities, carries sensory information from those organs. Because it has axons going way, way down into the abdominal cavity, it makes sense that this nerve would also carry parasympathetic neurons that will go to the smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands in those organs, okay? So this is a really important nerve for you guys to know about. You will talk about this a lot when you take physiology, because the vagus nerve has a lot to do with controlling internal organs in both the thoracic and abdominal cavities and maintaining homeostasis, okay, because it carries parasympathetic neurons to those organs. So this is really important, okay, the vagus nerve. Just need to know this for those 4 cranial nerves. Okay, so now we know the location of the preganglionic neurons. They would be located, again, in the brainstem and travel with cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10, right? And then in the lower region of the spinal cord from S2 through S4. So craniosacral. Okay, craniosacral. This, you just have to memorize. It's just the way it is. I don't know what to tell you about that. It's anatomy. Okay? Just do your best with that. I know you guys have a lot to, you know, a lot of stuff. The nervous system is a lot. I know. It's the way it is. Okay, so we said that these preganglionic neurons will go out somewhere and synapse in a ganglion. So where are the ganglia for the parasympathetic division? Okay, that's the other thing I would like you to know. This is super easy, okay? Because in the parasympathetic division, the ganglia are located actually either right in the organ's wall or right next to the organ. So these are called terminal ganglia because they're at the termination of the pathway. And that's all you need to know. See how easy? Sometimes it can be really easy. So for the parasympathetic, just know that the ganglia are called terminal ganglia because they're at the termination of the pathway. So when you take a look at this diagram again, you can kind of see this. Oh, I'm sorry, this is sympathetic. Wait a second, let me go back. Take a look at the parasympathetic one more time. So if you take a look at these neurons, you can see that they're showing the preganglionic in this brown color. The postganglionic is in gray. So notice that in the head area, there are some ganglia here that have their own names. You do not have to know those names. Okay, you don't have to know these. This is the vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10. You can see it comes from the medulla. Okay, that's where it exits from the brainstem. And you can see how long these preganglionic neurons are. Notice these go way down into the pelvic region, some of them, okay? And you can see that there's these little tiny short postganglionic neurons because the ganglia are located right in the organ or right next to the organ. So these ganglia out here, they're all called terminal ganglia, okay? That's all you need to know. You do not have to know these names here, okay? Okay, so let's talk about the sympathetic. Do you guys have questions on that before we go on?
You said vagus was 10?
Yes, cranial nerve 10. Questions? Okay, so the sympathetic is shown here. Notice that the preganglionic neurons are right in kind of the middle of the spinal cord. Remember we said that the sympathetic is also called the thoracolumbar division because the preganglionic neurons exit the spinal cord from T1 through L2, okay? T1 through L2. So thoracolumbar. So that's why that's another name for sympathetic. Okay, so where are the ganglia that these preganglionic neurons synapse in? Again, if you follow the brown axons out, you can see that they synapse in different places. Some of them synapse right here in this long chain of ganglia right next to the spinal cord, but some of them travel through that chain without synapsing and go out to other ganglia that are in the abdominal area. Notice this one actually goes way out to the adrenal gland, which sits on top of the kidney here. okay? So this is why, whenever we have a sympathetic response, like when we're in that fight or flight mode, we have the secretion of adrenaline, because some of these preganglionic neurons actually go to the adrenal gland. This is a ganglion for these neurons. Adrenaline is released into the blood. It's a hormone. So this gives us a longer lasting fight or flight response. It will have to, it will take roughly a half hour or so for adrenaline to be broken down in the blood. So this gives us this kind of longer lasting effect so that we can, run away from something that might be threatening us, fight, whatever we have to do. Okay? So in the sympathetic division, there's a few different possible ganglia. And let's just list those. So right next to the spinal cord, on either side of the spinal cord, we have this long chain of ganglia. This is just for the sympathetic neurons. This is what we were saying earlier when I was showing you the spinal nerve. I said we'll come back to those rami of the spinal nerve, okay? So this long chain of ganglia located right next to the spinal cord is called the sympathetic trunk, because this is just for the sympathetic neurons. It's a special chain of ganglia for the sympathetic neurons. Some of them will synapse here, okay? And you can see them showing that here. Then the postganglionic neuron goes out to the organ. But for organs that are in the abdominal area, notice there are other ganglia located right near those organs. Okay, so these three ganglia here are actually in the abdominal cavity. These are called collateral ganglia. Okay, they do have their own names, which I would like you to know. There's a celiac ganglion. There's a superior mesenteric. And there is an inferior mesenteric. These are actually named after blood vessels that are nearby. So that would be for organs in the abdominal cavity. Okay, and then one more location, one more ganglion, and that is the adrenal medulla. This is the center of the adrenal gland. This is the area that secretes adrenaline. Okay, so what would that look like? Here's our kidney, right? Here's the ureter. And the adrenal glands are like a little hat, kind of sitting on top of the kidney. The center of it is the adrenal medulla. So some of these preganglionic sympathetic neurons actually go to the adrenal medulla. They synapse on little short postganglionic sympathetic neurons here, but those neurons release the neurotransmitter into the blood, so it becomes a hormone, and it is called adrenaline. It's very similar in composition to the neurotransmitter that these neurons secrete. Okay, so these are the different possible ganglia for the sympathetic neurons. So you need to know that the preganglionic neurons are located from T1 through L2. Okay, thoracolumbar. And these are the ganglia. Yeah, so this is where the preganglionic neurons, cell bodies. So if we were to look at a cut somewhere in here through the spinal cord, we would see there are preganglionic neuron cell bodies in the lateral horn of the gray matter here. And actually, you're going to look at that. Okay, so I'll show you what I'm talking about. Okay, and these are the ganglia. That's what I meant to write down. here's the ganglia. Okay, so I know you guys are all wondering, well, how do these neurons get into the sympathetic trunk to synapse, right? Okay, so let's take a quick look at that. We're almost done. Yay. It's almost time to be done with the nervous system. Okay, so this is the stuff we just talked about, and okay, so notice that here we have these cuts through the spinal cord showing the preganglionic sympathetic neurons. This would be somewhere between T1 and L2. This is what it would look like. Okay, so notice that, again, it's kind of hard to see this, but they're trying to show you that this preganglionic neuron cell body is in the lateral horn here. Okay? So it's a lateral horn. Okay, again, because these are motor neurons, the axon goes out on the anterior root of the spinal nerve. Remember, this is going to only carry motor neurons. Comes together here with the posterior root. This is the spinal nerve. And then remember we had these two little connections or rami coming off the spinal nerve. I said we will come back to those because those are for sympathetic neurons. So this is actually how these sympathetic neurons get into the sympathetic trunk to synapse. Notice that this preganglionic neuron is going to go through this little connector here. This is actually called the white ramus. You can say white ramus communicans or just white ramus. Okay, this is the more lateral one. This is called the white ramus because the preganglionic neurons are myelinated. Okay, white matter. They're myelinated. Okay, so notice that it's coming in here. It's going to synapse on the postganglionic neuron, okay, shown in this gray color. The postganglionic neuron goes through the gray ramus. Okay, the gray ramus is more medial. This is called the gray ramus because these postganglionic neurons are unmyelinated. Okay, so the preganglionic go through the white ramus, the postganglionic go through the gray ramus, and the gray ramus will carry that neuron back to the spinal nerve, and eventually it will make its way out into the body. Okay? So you guys have these different kind of pictures of this in figure 18.8, and you will see that it gives you kind of a slightly different look depending on the tissue or the organ being supplied. You don't have to memorize all those different pathways. What I would like you to know here would be just what we just talked about, okay? Really, we've talked about everything on this diagram, so you should be able to identify everything. I mean, you should know the horns of the white matter or the gray matter in the spinal cord. You should know the roots of the spinal nerve. You should know these two rami. And you should know this is the sympathetic trunk, okay? So this diagram will be on the test. This is why when I say, when you're at the very beginning of a unit and you guys have like a weekend ahead of you, even though we haven't started talking about it, this is why you always want to get started, okay? Because you will thank yourself later. There's just so much material, especially with the nervous system. So, I don't know, it's just hard to get, through it all. So it's good to get that head start. So, that's it. So this diagram for the practical exam, also, just want to point out to you guys the sympathetic trunk on this model. This chain of ganglia here that's shown in pink, this is the sympathetic trunk. Okay, it only shows it on this side. It would also be located over here. They're just not showing it over here. And this is just kind of torn. This whole thing is the sympathetic trunk that comes all the way down. Okay, so you should know that's the sympathetic trunk. And you can also see, just so you know, just wanted to other spinal cord model. Someone had that spinal cord model that was, oh, thank you. So, just want to show you on this model, this is also the sympathetic trunk. So this is just a cut through the cervical region. The sympathetic trunk actually does extend way up into the cervical region. And so this is a sympathetic ganglion. You can identify this as either a sympathetic ganglion or you could say sympathetic trunk. And this is one of the rami. So actually, this is, because this would be where the postganglionic neuron is going back to the spinal nerve. This is really the gray ramus. The white rami are only located from T1 through L2. That's kind of a technicality that you don't really have to worry about. So if you just call this a sympathetic ramus, that's good enough. Okay, so this is the sympathetic ramus going into the sympathetic trunk. Okay, so that's it for the practical exam as far as the autonomic nervous system, just this diagram, and you should know the sympathetic trunk on these two models. That's it. The rest of this is just for the written exam. And I know right now it probably seems like a lot. It's really not that much. So just focus on these four things. And actually, I will talk about the neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitters are easy, but you can kind of just, condense it. And this would be sympathetic trunk. And the collateral ganglia in the abdominal cavity. And the adrenal medulla. So if you look at it like this is kind of everything you need to know. The two neurotransmitters are acetylcholine and norepinephrine. And so we'll talk about those real quick. Most of these neurons secrete acetylcholine. So this is really everything. Okay? But you still need to know the four cranial nerves that carry the parasympathetic neurons, what they do. Okay, but this is just this is a summary of everything. Okay, so the neurotransmitters are actually very easy for the autonomic nervous system. If you want to make a little table, the preganglionic and the postganglionic, we'll put those over here. This would be parasympathetic and sympathetic. Okay, so the preganglionic neurons actually for each division secrete acetylcholine. Okay, so that is what they secrete onto the postganglionic neuron. And the parasympathetic postganglionic neurons also secrete acetylcholine. The only neurons that are different are the sympathetic postganglionic. They secrete a neurotransmitter called norepinephrine. This is its abbreviation. And so this is why the two divisions have a different effect on their target organ, because they secrete a different neurotransmitter. If these were the same, then the two divisions would have the same effect. Okay, so again, just something for the written exam.
What's the difference between norepinephrine and epinephrine? Internally?
They're chemically similar, but they have slightly different chemical composition. So they have a slightly different effect on different tissues. Like for instance, epinephrine is the neurotransmitter that's secreted onto cardiac muscle, the parts of the heart that are supplied by the sympathetic neurons. And so there are receptors there for epinephrine, and it increases the heart rate and strength of contraction. In the walls of our blood vessels, there are receptors for norepinephrine, and the norepinephrine is what causes the vessel to constrict, which is what changes blood pressure. So different tissues have different receptors for the different neurotransmitters, and I guess just so that different tissues can be regulated differently. And this is a little bit of a, simplifying it just a little bit. For the most part, this is true, but there are some sympathetic neurons, postganglionic, I believe, that secrete acetylcholine. You guys will talk about this in a lot of detail and physiology. Right? You will spend some time on neurotransmitters and their receptors and how they work. Yeah. More time than you really want to spend, probably. Okay, so that is it. That's everything. And I don't want to take up a lot of your time with a review, but if you guys want to review with me, I will do that with you. If you'd rather just go ahead and look at models and the sheet brain and slides, you're welcome to do that. The review is, it's up to you, okay?